Thank you very much, Mrs. Elizabeth Grenade, for the introduction. I think I'm going to share my screen. Let me see what I can do. Can the host help me to share my screen? Because it seems. Okay, I think I can now proceed to share my screen. Right. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank the chairman of Integrity Commission and all the commissioners for inviting me. COVID has able to distance us physically, but it has not been able to break our spirit. And whatever the COVID have thrown at us, we've taken it in our strides, and we are still forging ahead. So with that said, I also want to thank Prime Minister Mitchell, who has supported my work in the region and particularly in the Grenada, where, of course, I'll be expecting my official citizenship as a Grenadian citizen, because I like the hospitality, the warmth of that Spice Island. Nothing compares. God's own country. I'm going to look at the components of national anti-corruption strategy. And as the convener mentioned, giving us the background from the UNCAC. So what I'm going to do in my few minutes is to look at the key preliminary observations of national anti-corruption strategies. Then we look at the UNCAC provision, as Mrs. Grenade has mentioned. Then I will look at the 5 key aspects of effective national anti-corruption documents. And then I'll briefly look at the processes of crafting national anti-corruption strategy. Then I'll look at the components or framework for a national anti-corruption strategy, and I conclude. Let me see, this is, okay, I can get this out of the way, yeah. Sorry. So the key preliminary observations of the national anti-corruption strategy. The first we have to look at is a national anti-corruption strategy is not merely a technocratic document whose implementation depends on whether national leaders are sufficiently determined to do so. Now, one purpose of developing and promulgating a national anti-corruption strategy is to help generate and maintain the leadership the citizens demand and broad support necessary to act effectively against corruption. So a strategic document that simply identifies a series of sound or noises or even sensible policies will not advance these objectives. The document, however, as well as its processes for drafting it and for ensuring the post-promulgation implementation and revision, should create a sense of ownership and commitment among those both inside and outside the government, and should establish targets and benchmark that enable both domestic and foreign audiences to hold government accountable to the goals it has set itself. A second point is also that the strategy drafters must strike a balance between ambition and realism. A strategy that is too cautious and limited, one that proposes only easy to achieve policy changes, may not address a community's most pressing corruption concerns, and will thus generate the excitement, and does not generate excitement, focus, and pressure needed to make significant progress in preventing and combating corruption. On the other hand, an overly ambitious strategy with grand objectives that are not feasible given the country's resources and capacity will be ignored or even dismissed as impractical and might further contribute to a sense of frustration and resignation among the citizenry. So therefore, the balance between ambition and realism is not an easy one to strike, and the right approach will vary by country. But those responsible for developing the national anti-corruption strategy must be mindful of it at every stage of the process. So for you to look at national anti-corruption strategy, the starting point is that we have to look at the UNCAC provisions. And among the relevant UNCAC clauses, Article 5 is relevant because it imposes a more general requirement that each state party or any country that have signed up to the UNCAC develop and implement or maintain effective coordinated anti-corruption policies, establish and promote effective practices aimed at prevention of corruption, and periodically evaluate relevant legal instruments and administrative measures with a view to determining their adequacy to prevent and fight corruption. Furthermore, under Article 6 of the same convention, see that each state party is required to ensure the existence of a body or bodies as appropriate that prevent corruption by implementing the policies referred to in Article 5, and where appropriate, overseeing and coordinating the implementation of those policies. That's one of the most important obligations of the state parties under the convention, and to which they are to be held accountable under the mechanism of the review of implementation of the convention established under Article 663(1), is ensuring that their anti-corruption policies are effective, coordinated, and regularly assessed. So that has given us the background why we should have national anti-corruption strategy. Now, the 5 key aspects of effective national anti-corruption strategies document is: 1, the drafting process of the strategy should be overseen by a body that has sufficient autonomy, expertise, and political backing, and should involve substantive input from key stakeholders from both inside and outside government. Here, I must say that that body may be responsible, but most of the time, from my experiences, they get support from consultants and UNODC and others to help them. But that body, most of the time, it will be the Integrity Commission or the anti-corruption body. They own the process. The strategy should contain a preliminary evaluation and diagnosis of the main corruption challenges that the country faces. So that means it should be country specific, including the obstacles to the implementation of the effective anti-corruption policy, the preliminary diagnosis should also identify gaps and limitations in the current knowledge and understanding of those issues. 3, based on the preliminary evaluation and diagnosis, the strategy should contain an anti-corruption body that lays out ambitious but realistic objectives, identify top priorities in both the near term and the longer term, and establishes the appropriate sequencing of reforms. 4, the strategy should include the implementation plan, in which responsibility for overseeing its execution is assigned to a coordination unit, a mechanism to ensure the various agencies carrying out different aspects cooperate with one another are provided for. The strategy should contain a plan for monitoring and evaluating the plan's implementation and impact to ensure that the elements of the policy plan are properly executed, that they are having the desired impact, and that they can be revised as necessary. So if you look at the processes, start with the drafting process. So here, you're going to assign responsibility for drafting the strategy to a small, semi-autonomous group. Ensure the continued support and involvement of senior political leaders. And they should consult regularly with all government agencies that will be affected by the strategy. They should solicit the views of political opposition whenever possible. Engage all sectors of society in the drafting process and emphasize communication, transparency, and outreach throughout the drafting process. Allocate sufficient time and resources to the drafting the strategy and take advantage of other countries' experience and expertise. In the diagnosis part, you conduct a preliminary diagnosis of corruption challenges, self-assessment, peer reviews, and other assessment. You also do cross-country comparison of corruption or governance, country-specific surveys of corruption perceptions, surveys of actual experience with corruption. Can use internet platform and social media to garner information collected by government agencies, comparisons of in different data sources. You do vulnerability assessment and studies, proxy measurement, because in corruption you cannot have direct, so normally we use proxy measurement. Then you evaluate the resources constraint and address potential opposition and support. In terms of the formulating, you tailor the strategy to the diagnosis, taking account of the constraints, be ambitious but realistic, identify concrete specific measures to be taken, describe the objective of each reform element, consider the cost, benefit, burden, opposition, and support for each element. Pay attention to prioritization and sequencing, and specify implementation time for different reforms. In terms of the implementation, you put a single high-level entity in charge of coordination and implementation. Provide the coordination and implementation body with sufficient authority. Foster cooperation between the coordinating body and implementation agents. And harness the power of repetition. Have each agency agree to an implementation, monitoring, and evaluation schedule. Do not underestimate the challenges of coordinating and implementation. Now, a point I'll make here is that when you have the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which of course the body will be the Integrity Commission who will supervise and make sure that it is. But the strategy is not Integrity or Anti-Corruption Body's strategy. It's a national strategy. So its implementation, from my work that I've done around, is always supposed to be coordinated or chair or supervised from the office of the Prime Minister, where they can bring together all government agencies to be compliant with the implementation of the plan. Of course, the Secretariat and the coordination will be done by the lead body or agents, which is the Integrity Commission. There should be a monitoring and evaluation of the implementation, because if you don't monitor, you will not know what is going to happen. So you disaggregate policy reforms into discrete step or action step. You select one or more indicators for progress, choose a baseline for each indicator, establish realistic target for each implementation indicator, watch for indicator manipulation, because some of the indicators may give you different results. Be cautious when using agency self-evaluation, because when you use self-evaluation, they tend to enhance the reality than it is. So you may want to use independent agency also to do that. Utilize evaluation to adjust implementation target and strategy goals and allocate sufficient time and adequate resources for evaluation. Do not use year-to-year changes in corruption index scores to measure strategic impact. Rather, select impact indicator or indicators that can be compared over time. Isolate the impact of the policy implemented pursuant to the strategy and be sensitive to the cost and time required. Involve civil society organizations, important, scholars, research organizations, and citizens generally, and provide method for ongoing revision to the strategy. Now, reporting. Internal reporting as part of the coordination mechanism, ensuring accountability of the implementation process, and reporting to higher authorities in the executive or the parliament. Public reporting ensures transparency in the implementation of the national strategy. So the last point here will be the component or the framework for national anti-corruption strategy. The first component will be the anti-corruption laws and the law enforcement. You strengthen the anti-corruption laws and the law enforcement, including in such areas as laws against embezzlement and other misappropriation of property in both the public and the private sectors. Formulating anti-corruption measures, anti-bribery laws, both domestic and foreign, laws against improper trading in influence or other abuse of the functions of the public office, law targeting the process of corruption, including laws to counter money laundering and measures to facilitate the identification, freezing, confiscation, and the return of illegally obtained assets. So your anti-corruption framework or the component, the strategy should have a very heavy dosage of anti-corruption laws and law enforcement. The next component part should be the whistleblower protection. Adequate protection for whistleblowers and witnesses is important, and it should be covered in the strategy. Legal tools or reforms that may facilitate the effective prosecution of corrupt activities to the extent that they are consistent with domestic legal traditions and basic principles of fairness. And this includes liability for illicit enrichment, obstruction of justice, participation and attempt, recognition that knowledge or intent may be inferred from factual circumstances, liability of legal as opposed to natural person, and appropriately extended statutes of limitation. The component also should include sanctions, meting out appropriate sanctions for corrupt behavior, including civil and criminal remedies, and doing so fairly. There's be a heavy dosage of corruption prevention in the strategy. Implementing a more effective measures to prevent corruption measures whilst reducing incentives and or the opportunities for corruption. Such reforms might include: 1, measures to prevent corruption in the public sector, including through promotion of integrity in public administration, strengthening public sector ethics, which is important, addressing corruption risk in procurement and in the budgeting process, and promoting transparency and civic partnership. There should be also a private sector corruption component. Measures to prevent corruption in the private sector, including transparency and reporting measures, accounting controls, and auditing. There should be educational part in the component, establishing education programs, publicity campaigns, and awareness raising initiatives intended to change attitude towards corruption, shift cultural norms, and encourage reporting. There should also be institutional capacity. Institutional capacity providing adequate training and ensuring the effectiveness, autonomy, and integrity of the government bodies that implement anti-corruption policy. There should be domestic and international coordination. Improving both domestic and international coordination between law enforcement authorities and other agencies responsible for combating corruption, as well as between the public and the private. So the component is all inclusive. So in conclusion, an effective national anti-corruption strategy should ensure that national efforts are joined up across government and include close collaboration with civil societies, private sector, law enforcement, and other partners who play a critical role in tackling corruption. Thank you.